the Provincial Specialist for Plant Disease with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and she's joining us today to talk a little bit about Sclerotinia Management. We had a preview on Sclerotinia Management at the end of June for some of the crops that were coming into flower earlier this year. But certainly there are a lot of crops that are still just coming into flower, some of the later seeded crops, and in some instances where fungicide applications have been delayed, there may be some questions about the current risk. I know in the Peace region there's been a lot of rain lately after some dry conditions early on, and in Manitoba it's the opposite. We had really wet conditions early on, and now we've had some hotter and somewhat drier weather in some regions. So Faye is going to give us a bit of an update on where things are at, but also talk a little bit in general about how diseases affect canola and about some of the past results from the disease survey that she's been involved with over the last couple of years, and talk about what the management options are with regard to Sclerotinia and canola. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Faye, and if Crystal can make her the presenter, we'll switch over.
All right, thank you very much, Derwin. And can you guys let me know if you can see my screen and hear me?
Yep, you bet. It's up and sound nice and clear.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining me this afternoon. It's a hot, sunny day in Regina. I don't know what it's like where all of you are, but I appreciate you taking some time to stay inside and join me on this webinar. Maybe it's a little bit too hot to be outside anyways. So we're going to talk a little bit about Sclerotinia management, as Derwin mentioned, and one of the biggest things that he already kind of touched on being the weather forecast and how much rain that we've had this year and how much moisture we might continue to receive will definitely be a large factor in how much Sclerotinia that we get as a result. But there's a lot of different things to think about when it comes to disease management. What is disease, I guess, is the first thing. And before we really get into managing them, it's important to understand what they really are and what the potential impact might be. And so as many of you probably know, plant diseases can be caused by pathogens such as fungi, which Sclerotinia would fall into that category, but also other diseases can be caused by bacteria, viruses, phytoplasmas, even nematode damage and environmental stresses can be categorized under the plant disease area. But really, no matter what, when we're talking about disease, we're usually talking about signs and symptoms of disease. So something that is altered in the plant that is causing a negative effect and causing this disease, causing an impact which will be of concern to farmers. So ultimately, as farmers, we are concerned about our crop quality and our yield. And so if we have plant disease infection, we may get something like a root infection, so reduction of root growth, reduction of uptake by those roots of water and nutrients into the plant, a restriction of stem flow. So stem flow, that's a big one when it comes to Sclerotinia. If you have an infection of the stem, the lower down on the plant it is, and the larger number of branches affected, the greater impact that you'll have, which makes sense. The more the plant is restricted in being able to take up the water and nutrients, the more of a yield impact you'll have. Other types of diseases too may affect the leaf surface, the amount of green surface area that we have in the plants. If you have a leaf lesion, such as what you might see with blackleg, you could see how you would have a reduction of photosynthesis as a result, and therefore a reduction of plant yield. And as well with other diseases such as the aster yellows shown in this photo, we can have flower and head infections which will directly impact the yield as well as have the potential to affect the crop quality. So these are the reasons why we're concerned about plant diseases. It's fairly obvious, but sometimes it's nice to start with the basics when we're really considering what impacts diseases have and why do we really care about them. And we need to address that, why we're concerned, in order to determine whether we really should be controlling them or not. So as we've seen in many areas of the prairies in the last couple years, we've had some extremely wet conditions in some areas. Certainly in Saskatchewan last year, we had many areas that had an increased amount of moisture, and as a result, we saw a lot of different plant diseases showing up. maybe some that we have seen at low levels in other years, just showing up more, and maybe ones in areas that we didn't think were an issue really began to appear because of the wet conditions. So why would this be? Well, most of the plant diseases occurring in Western Canada are caused by fungal organisms, and it just so happens that most fungi like warm, moist conditions and rich nutrient sources. So when we get a wet year, if we get prolific crop growth, we can see why it would also be good conditions for disease. The different types of fungi that we have in our environment may live as saprophytes, which means that they'll be breaking down dead material. Those can live for a lot longer in the soil because they don't require a living host in order to survive. Others, which would be pathogens, can infect and feed on living hosts, so they do require sometimes a very specific host in order to survive in the environment. And some are opportunistic, so they might live as saprophytes in the absence of a viable host, and then if the right conditions and the right host come along, then they'll behave as a pathogen. Now, excess moisture can also affect the plant's susceptibility to disease. So I mentioned that diseases will often be found in conditions where we have really good conditions for crop growth and really healthy, thick crops. But you can also see diseases in situations where you have the opposite effect. So maybe you have stressed out plants, maybe they're going to be stressed and therefore more susceptible to disease, kind of like you or I. If we get a little bit weak, maybe we'll be more prone to getting a cold, things like that. Also, too, with excess moisture early on in the season, we often see crops that have increased length of the susceptible growth stage because the crops are very uneven. Or even within a region, we might have crops that are planted at very different times because we're just trying to get the crops in and have a lot longer of a spring trying to get those crops planted. And I think that's what we saw in a lot of areas this spring, and what we'll probably see is some variability of the crop staging across the prairies. So while we may have some listeners on the line today and a lot of farmers around whose crops are far past the stage of control of Sclerotinia and canola, past that 50% bloom stage, we might also have some crops that are just starting to come up on that stage as well. So we're really seeing a lot of variability out there. Now, just in general, when we're talking about plant diseases, we often discuss integrated disease management tools. So this is considering our management as a toolbox in which we have many different ways of managing disease. So it's not just coming in with a fungicide at the 20 to 50% bloom stage for Sclerotinia, but it's thinking of the bigger picture. So we have crop rotation and disease-tolerant cultivars, prevention and sanitation measures, seedling health and seed treatments, so just getting the crop off to as good of a start as possible. We have crop scouting and foliar fungicides during the season, and good record keeping and planning. So of course we might not be able to use all of these tools at once, and at this point in the season our crop rotation will be out of our control, but we can be thinking about it already for next year. We can consider what type of tolerance, if any, our cultivars have when considering whether or not it will be worth spraying. Prevention and sanitation measures would be if you're dealing with a disease that could be spread through movement of soil or movement of spores on the plant. So Sclerotinia probably wouldn't be necessarily too concerned about that at this point, but it's definitely one to always keep in mind with IPM of diseases. Seedling health and seed treatments, well, we're past that stage for this season, but keeping in mind the health of your seedlings, of your canola crop, will give you an idea of what to expect later on down the road. So we're kind of at the stage of crop scouting and foliar fungicides. So for any of the crops right now that are at or prior to the 20 to 50% bloom stage for Sclerotinia control in canola, we could be considering scouting the crops, not necessarily for disease symptoms, but scouting for those apothecia, which we'll talk about a little later on, and considering a foliar fungicide application. For any of the crops that are past that stage, we should be thinking about record keeping and planning. So going back into the field later on after it's been sprayed to see how good of control you had with Sclerotinia, or whether or not you sprayed, you still should go out and take a look and see how much incidence you have so that you can plan for the next time you grow canola or another susceptible crop in that field. You'll keep that in mind for your future disease management decisions. So Sclerotinia stem rot, or also known as Sclerotinia white mold, or often we just refer to it as Sclerotinia, it affects basically all of the different broadleaf crops that we grow in the prairies, has that potential. Definitely canola is one of the top ones on our radar. It can have quite a severe impact on sunflowers, a more minor crop, but very susceptible to Sclerotinia. Lentils had a lot of problems with Sclerotinia and botrytis in the lentil growing areas of Saskatchewan last year. And so we know that there is that potential on lentils. We see it sometimes on peas. It doesn't seem to cause as much of a yield impact, but definitely if you get infection, you can just continue on that disease cycle, allowing the inoculum to be sustained for the next time that you grow a crop that has a higher risk of having yield damage. It can affect flax as well, but although we might see it every once in a while, we don't seem to get a lot of reports of really a lot of damage occurring. But again, if you have even low levels of infection on susceptible crops, it's enough to keep the inoculum fresh in the soil for the next time you grow a more susceptible crop. So the disease cycle of Sclerotinia might be a little hard to read on your screen with some small writing there, but hopefully you can get the idea of what the Sclerotinia disease cycle looks like, and a couple of points on the cycle that are favored by moist conditions. So that weather always being really important to whether we'll see the disease or not. Because it is a long-living disease. If you have Sclerotinia in the soil, it can survive several years, so even more than your 4-year rotation. But if you have dry conditions, you probably won't have too much of an issue with Sclerotinia. However, if you have any moisture during the right time, so enough moisture to cause those sclerotia to germinate into apothecia, which I mentioned earlier, the apothecia is what you see in the picture on the very bottom of this disease cycle. So on B, I guess, is what it's labeled. So you have Sclerotinia sclerotia that have overwintered and are in the soil, exposed to enough moisture that they can germinate, and they'll produce spores. Now these spores can only infect canola petals. Well, they can infect other crops, but when it comes to canola, the spores are not strong enough to infect the canola plant directly. It needs to feed off of those petals as they're senescing and dying and falling off, and use that as a nutrient source to get enough energy to infect other parts of the plant. So as the petals fall, they'll land on a stem or a leaf or in the crook of where the leaf is attached to the stem, and get a drop of moisture coming in there as well. Really good conditions for the Sclerotinia to be able to get into the plant and have the biggest impact if it gets into the stem and restricts that water nutrient flow from getting up to the rest of the plant. So what conditions have favored this disease cycle up till now? So some areas we may have seen those moist conditions leading into the flowering period, which will have resulted in the production of these apothecia. And it's a really good idea to get out there and scout and see if you can find the apothecia, which will give you an indication that you have a risk if you're heading into the flowering stage. Now, another, I guess, later on, you might see where the petals have fallen. You might see drops of water forming with petals, and you might see some early signs of disease. At that point, it is too late to control, but it's still important to keep your eyes peeled and see if you see any of these symptoms. So as we move through this disease cycle up through D, E, and F, we can see that we're watching for the development of the disease, although it's too late to control. And later on in the season, as the plant breaks down and things start to bleach and dry out, we see the sclerotia bodies that will have formed in the infected plant material, and those will go back into the soil and create that possible inoculum for the future. So important to look at the cycle, think about the conditions that have favored it up until this point, and continued moist conditions will help that disease develop if the infection has taken place. What we can do about it, well, we've mentioned the 20 to 50% bloom stage several times. Can never, say that enough, I guess, when it comes to deciding whether to spray or not. The timing is very important. And we'll talk a little bit more about other factors in deciding whether to spray or not. So I have put in here a couple maps which show the incidence of Sclerotinia in 2010, and we'll talk a little bit about what we see in our disease surveys in the past, particularly in 2010, and what we might expect as a result for 2011. So as I mentioned, there are multiple hosts of Sclerotinia, but this map in particular shows Saskatchewan Sclerotinia incidence in canola in 2010. And we did see more Sclerotinia than we're used to in last year just because of the wet conditions, but as you can see, it still was variable across the province, and it really depends on the conditions, even field to field, as well as from one region to the next. As far as Alberta, they also did a map showing their disease survey results, and so you can see again some variability across the province, but basically you can see Sclerotinia in those really major canola growing areas and areas where we had a lot of moisture last year. So a little bit more about what we saw last year. Actually, 91% of the canola crops we surveyed in Saskatchewan had at least a trace amount of Sclerotinia, and our average incidence was 20% with a severity of 2.5. And I'll get into a little bit here what that actually means as far as yield loss, because of course that's what we're the most concerned about. But just looking at, for those of you from Alberta or Manitoba, in Alberta, 64% of the canola crops surveyed had at least a trace amount, and the incidence was 15% with a severity of 2.1. So quite a bit less as far as prevalence goes, the number of crops affected, but in the crops that were affected, the incidence was just a little bit lower than Saskatchewan, and the severity was just slightly lower as well. For Manitoba, 88% of the crops surveyed had at least a trace, and the incidence was 31% and a severity of 2.4. So the severity was similar across the provinces, but the incidence was the highest in Manitoba, and the prevalence was highest in Saskatchewan. So what this means, as an example, I have used the different regions for Saskatchewan results from the survey last year. And if their overall mean was 20%, that means that on average in a field, 20% of the plants were affected to some degree by Sclerotinia. And one rule of thumb that has been used before for determining yield loss is to take your incidence divided by 2. And that would be the percent yield loss you could expect. So if we had a 20% incidence, we could have expected about a 10% yield loss as a result. But as you can imagine, incidence doesn't really take into account how bad the disease is on each plant. So you could have 20% of your plants slightly affected, or 20% of your plants very, very heavily, lower stem lesions, almost complete yield loss of those plants. And so it's just a very general rule of thumb that isn't going to hit the nail on the head every time. So we did severity ratings for the first time this year as well, and I mentioned the severities were similar across the province. And on average, the severity last year was about 2.5%, 2.1 to 2.4% in the other provinces. So if you look on the chart on the right, this will put us somewhere around where the lesion is situated on the main stem or branches and has the potential to affect up to a quarter of the seed formation and filling on the plant. Now we can also see when we use the Saskatchewan data, and I apologize to those that are not from Saskatchewan that only have data for Saskatchewan here, but I think that really the take-home message here is not specific to Saskatchewan. The take-home message is that in general, when we have wet conditions, we have a higher amount of Sclerotinia, and when we have years that were generally dry, we don't see very much of it at all. So we did have an increase last year in what we would consider in many areas to have been very wet. So this will give us an idea if we have any regions where we would consider the conditions to be very wet again this year, that we can expect in those areas we would have higher Sclerotinia. But we have had some regions as well that have been more dry this year, and so we can expect hopefully less Sclerotinia in those areas. So as I said, any areas that have received a lot of moisture this season, particularly prior to and during canola flowering, we can expect more Sclerotinia to occur. Late infections can also take place towards the end of flowering, so if we continue to get some wet conditions here later in the season, we might see some later infections that won't have as much of a yield impact, but could be still appearing in the field, so quite visible, and putting inoculum back into the soil for next year, but hopefully not causing as much yield damage. But with the hot weather in some areas this week, I think that the risk should decrease, hopefully, if we don't get too much moisture around the same time. So what can we do? Well, once again, I'll mention the fungicide, but not to say that that's the only answer for sure, because it has to be economical and it has to be timed properly. But because we're just around that stage for a lot of the crops, it's important to keep that in mind. And when we start to see the flowers appear, then we'll have to be thinking about the weather. So watch for showers when you start to see flowers. Rain in the last 2 weeks and rain in the forecast will increase the risk of sclerotinia. So we'll be looking for those apothecia, as I mentioned, so you can get down as low as possible into the crop canopy, looking at the soil, and trying to find those apothecia. They can be quite elusive trying to find them, but when you do, once you kind of get your eye on it, then if you're in a field that has a lot, as soon as you see one, you'll probably see very, very many. As you can see by this picture, in a field that I found apothecia, it wasn't hard to find them when they were really there and really producing a lot. So these apothecia will be producing spores, and if the crop is in the early stages of flowering, it'll be the most susceptible. Anything that's infected early on will have the greatest potential for yield losses. So what else can we do? We can think about what to do in the future, lengthening rotations in affected fields. If you have a very heavily infested field, you might want to consider lengthening the rotation, although this can be a challenge because it is a long-living disease and because canola is not the only susceptible crop. So peas, lentils, canola, sunflower will all be susceptible and have to be taken into consideration with the crop rotation. So just a few examples. Many of you may have seen the Canola Council's resource, which is a Sclerotinia stem rot checklist. And so I've just put the checklist into a table format here for us to go through and just look at a few different scenarios as examples of what we might see in the field and how this would translate into the checklist and whether to spray or not. So we'll go through each of these categories and assign a risk point value, and if our risk points add up to 40 or greater, then we would be considering a fungicide application. So the number of years since the last host crop, the shorter the number of years, the higher the risk point. So let's give an example of where we've had canola maybe last year or the year before, would give us a risk point of 10. Next, we look at the disease incidence in the last host crop. So this is where those field records are really important, and so even if you have already sprayed and you want to forget about the Sclerotinia for this year, it's important to go back into the field at some point, even if it's just before harvest, get somewhat of an idea of how much disease ended up showing up in your field so that you can keep this in mind the next time you have a susceptible crop in that field and take that into account for whether to spray. So if you had a moderate, the 11 to 30%, so if last year was our example where we had 20% on average, let's say that we had 20% in our fields and we have another 10 points for a risk value there. Next, you want to look at your crop density this year. If you have a very dense crop, it'll be more moist and more susceptible to disease. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of times conditions that are good for development of a really nice looking crop will also be good for development of disease. So the higher the crop density, the higher the risk. So let's just give an example this time that we have a normal crops density. So 5 is our risk point value. So we have 25 points for this one. And we have 3 more categories to go. So the next is the rain that we've received in the last 2 weeks. So if we've had not very much rain, we don't need to have risk points assigned there. 10 to 30 millimeters will give a risk point value of 5, so we'll use that for our example. Greater than 30 millimeters, where we may have had in some parts of Saskatchewan at least, would have a higher value of 10. Next is the weather forecast. This is going to be the trickiest one because, as we know, it can be really difficult to find a good, reliable weather forecast and really difficult to predict the weather. And I think sometimes when it comes to forecasting disease, the best thing that we can have is a good weather forecast. And so maybe pathologists should be putting more of our efforts into developing good weather forecasting systems. But until then, we'll use our best guess as to what type of rain we can be expecting as our crop is flowering. So let's give the example of 10. And apothecial development. So this is where you're down in the crop canopy, you're looking for those apothecia, and if you think that you haven't found any, hopefully that's the case, but sometimes they can be hard to see, so you want to look as hard as you can to see if you see them. And if nothing else, if you're unsure, you can kind of keep in mind what type of incidents you had last year and whether you think there's a good chance that there could be some apothecia development in your field. And also keep in mind that there is that possibility that spores, because the spores produced by apothecia can become airborne, they can be transferred in from other fields, although most of the spores produced by an apothecium will end up within 100 meters of where they're produced. So not a lot will go from field to field, but it is possible. So in our example, we've got 25 points on the previous slide and 25 from these last three factors, and so we have a total of 50, which would be warranting a spray, as long as you also consider that the cost of the application is less than the amount that you think that you would lose in terms of yield with your crop. So it's also important to keep those economics in mind, whether or not it will actually pay enough of a yield boost in order to cover the cost of your fungicide application if the crop is valuable enough and has enough yield potential to cover it as well. So just looking at another scenario, so maybe you had a longer crop rotation, so our risk point value is lower. In the first category, our disease incidence in the last crop was lower. We'd have a 5, 5, and of normal density would have another 5. So 15 this time for this example. And in the last three categories, so maybe we had low risk values when it came to our previous crop and crop conditions, but what if we had a lot of rain? So more than 30 millimeters would give us 10. We've got variable weather in the forecast, and we have seen apothecia development in the neighborhood of our crop. And that would actually still put us over our 40 threshold, and so still be considering a fungicide application in that case. So even when you do things right in your crop, you might still have a high risk of disease just because we've had weather conditions that are so very conducive to disease. And unfortunately, it is often the weather that really makes that final determination of how much we'll have. The last example, again, we'll use a lower risk on the crop side of it, so a longer rotation, nothing for disease in the last host crop, and a normal crop density, give us a value of 10. Plus, what if we had lots of rain, but it's looking like it's going to dry out? So this might be the case for a lot of people out there where we've had rainy conditions this spring, and it's really turning hot this week. So our risk will be lower with the forecast and low numbers of apothecia. So this would put us at a total value of 30. And so this would be a situation where we might be able to get away with not spraying. So those are just some different calculations of actually using the examples that we have with the Sclerotinia checklist. So in the first couple scenarios, we said that it would warrant a spray. So what kind of application can we use? Now that checklist was only to be used for canola. So I've listed the options that we have for canola. Everything listed here can be used on canola except for Allegro and Senator. Those are only registered for beans. But some of the ones registered for canola can also be used on pulse crops. We also have a product called Contans, which would not be sprayed onto the crop. However, it can be applied to the soil to kill the sclerotia, but it has to be applied 3 months prior to a susceptible crop being grown. So that's just another option that we have there. So some different products to keep in mind, and if you have sprayed canola before for Sclerotinia in that field, or use that product for any other reason, you might want to consider choosing a different mode of action just so that we can try to prevent the buildup of fungicide-resistant population in the Sclerotinia population. So again, if disease risk warrants, application take place between the 20 to 50% bloom. If it's too early and the flowers are not yet open, or there's not very many flowers open, then it's not, you have to hold off until you get as many flowers as possible to protect, because that Sclerotinia can only initiate disease by infecting the petals. If it's too late and you're past that 50% bloom stage, you can still get some protection of the blossoms that are being produced. However, there'll be less of a chance of a yield benefit because any infections that will take place at those later stages have less likely chance to impact the yield. So those blossoms, as they fall off, will be landing higher in the canopy, might be causing some infections on the upper branches, but really the earlier that infection takes place and the lower down the petals fall into the stem, the bigger chance there is of yield impact. And so if your canopy is closed in and the petals can't fall down as far, and if they have a longer distance to fall and so they'll land up in the upper canopy instead, then there won't be as much of damage due to Sclerotinia, and therefore less beneficial to spray. So how can you tell what bloom stage you're at and if it's appropriate to spray? Now I've just included a link here to Bayer. This is not to promote their products over any others, but just to show you an example of a bloom stage guide, which I found was pretty useful. And so I'll just click through it. Hopefully you can see it. But I won't take too long on it because you can go through this on your own with your own crop. But basically, you want to find the main stem, pull off the secondary branches, count only the open flowers on the main stem, including the aborted flowers and newly formed pods, and sample several plants across the field. So I'll just describe for you the optimum timing being at 20 to 50%. So 20% would be 14 to 16 open flowers on the main stem. 30%, which is probably the most optimal point, would be approximately 20 open flowers on the main stem. And 50% bloom would be more than 20 open flowers on the main stem. And after that will be past the point of fungicide application. So really just doing a quick search on the internet, you can find a bloom stage guide that will help you make that assessment of your crop. Now, some of you out there might also be lentil growers, and given the amount of Sclerotinia and botrytis that we had in our lentil crops last year, I wanted to quickly mention what the potential was for Sclerotinia in lentils as well, keeping in mind that if you're growing lentils where canola has been grown in the past, you have that risk of inoculum infecting your lentils, or if you had a canola crop where lentil was grown in the past, you could also see that you might have a higher risk of disease as a result. And when it comes to lentils, applications are generally ineffective in controlling Sclerotinia white mold because the disease does not show up until the canopy is closed in and dense and it's really moist under the canopy, and often you get lodging of the plants, which is perfect conditions for disease, but it doesn't allow penetration of the fungicide. So although the products that we have available are effective against the disease, it's so difficult to get the product where we need it to control that it is unlikely to be of economic benefit to spray. So if you have other lentil diseases like Ascochyta and anthracnose, you will be spraying fungicides before the canopy closes. And that can give you some benefit for early control of Sclerotinia and botrytis, but if we get moist conditions later on in the season like we had last year, we could still see Sclerotinia and botrytis and not really be able to do much about it at that point. Might get the question again, maybe you or your neighbor has a lentil crop that's near a canola crop, and does this mean that you could get spread of the disease from the canola to the lentils or from the lentils to the canola within that one season? And the answer is no, because Sclerotinia is a monocyclic disease, which means there's only one disease cycle per year, and the spores will be infecting the canola will be from germinated sclerotia in the soil, which can spread from field to field, but you won't get production of those sclerotia causing spore production from an infected crop spreading to a susceptible crop this year. It would have to take place next year. Although mold that's growing on infected plant can spread through plant-to-plant contact, it's quite unlikely that you would have a lentil field next to a canola field where you could have direct plant-to-plant contact spreading those molds. And the spores will not be produced on infected plants, so you won't be able to you won't see spread for that reason. But if you know that you had sclerotia in your crop residue from previous years, certainly you could get spread of those spores from field to field. But again, most of the inoculum will end up very close to where it was produced and not so much spreading from field to field. So some considerations when to stop spraying or when to decide that it's too late to spray, or for it's also can be kept in mind for any disease situation, maybe ones where you're doing multiple sprayer applications. At some point, we have to say that it's time to stop. So in that case, you want to look at some different considerations. The first is your variety. So if you have resistant or tolerant canola, or with other diseases, maybe you have good disease resistance, then maybe it's not as necessary to spray depending on the situation. The staging is probably the most important. You need to protect the part of the plant that's the most susceptible or the most likely to cause a yield impact if it is infected. And so if you see symptoms, it's too late to spray. And the earlier that you get in there to protect it, the better chance that you have, because the earliest infections will cause the most damage. For pulses, as I mentioned, again, after that canopy closes, your applications will be generally ineffective because you just can't get penetration of the product. So is the disease present? Fungicides do not cure disease, so if you have not achieved effective control already by the time you see symptoms, or if those symptoms become widespread, it's usually too late to apply a fungicide. If the crop has been damaged by other factors, you need to think about whether it's worth saving. So what is the value of the crop? As I said before, do you think that the value of the crop is enough and the yield benefit that you get from spraying is enough to cover the cost of the application? Consider if it has received other damage, does it have time to recover? So if you get hail damage, has been some hailstorms going through the province even just in the last couple days due to these hot conditions. So maybe take a look at how much damage there is and how much time you think that it will have to recover, and again, is it worth saving? For pulse crops, if there's flowers developing and you want to protect the crop as it gets later into the season, you have to think about whether those flowers will have time to mature and produce seed before fall hits and before we want to start harvesting. So with pulse crops, sometimes using a fungicide application can prolong the crop development. And so if we have a late crop to begin with, we don't necessarily want to spray and prolong that even longer. So weather conditions, warm, dry weather will naturally control disease as well as help progress the crops to maturity, whereas the wet weather, as we said several times, will favor disease and potentially delay maturity. So keeping that in mind, whether you want to do a later application or not. What impact are you expecting from the disease, and to what degree do you anticipate that the fungicide will actually improve the crop yield and quality? So really, what are your expectations around that, and will you make enough money after harvest to pay for the application? And I've said that a couple times already. Other considerations, particularly when it comes to other diseases where you, as I said, might have multiple applications. How many times has it already been sprayed, and do you expect this to be the last spray? Have you already reached your maximum number of applications allowed by the fungicide? And have you used a proper fungicide rotation to prevent fungicide resistance? If you're considering late applications, so this is probably more thinking about those pulses where if you're seeing Sclerotinia showing up, you might be considering a later application. You want to look at that pre-harvest interval of the fungicide and determine whether or not we're too close to harvest to warrant a later application. So these are more of general when to stop spraying recommendations that go a little bit beyond just that Sclerotinia timing, but I think it's important to kind of reiterate that as well. So another issue that comes up with other crops affected by Sclerotinia might be the seed quality, although you could get some sclerotia as well in the more upper canopy infections with canola. Sclerotinia was definitely an issue for seed quality on lentil crops last year, so saw it a lot in seed testing labs showing up along with the botrytis, so Sclerotinia and botrytis being two molds that kind of go hand in hand with lentil crops. So that could be a concern if we get later infection of Sclerotinia, again, if we get wet conditions later on this season. Something to think about, crop rotation. So with a non-host specific disease like Sclerotinia, if you have rotations that involve two more susceptible crops like canola and lentils, then chances are you'll see a higher risk of diseases like Sclerotinia. As well with other diseases that are more host-specific, so like blackleg on canola or Ascochyma anthracnose on lentil, you want to avoid growing like canola on canola or lentil on lentil, so those really tight crop rotations. So just something to keep in mind, because this is the time of year that whether it's time to spray or too late to spray, really checking your crops and seeing what kind of diseases are out there should play a role in determining what your crop rotation is for next time if you're looking at diseases that might affect your next crop choice. Another question that has come up because of the situation we've had in some areas in the last couple of years is whether the flooding that we've seen in some areas will reduce the Sclerotinia. So the ability of those sclerotia to survive could be compromised by the fact that they'd be sitting under a lot of water and possibly drowning out. And so there has been some research which has shown under dry, moderate temperature conditions, 65% of the normal sclerotia produced will remain viable after 5 years. Whereas under other research has shown that when you're comparing the high soil moisture to low soil moisture, you do have a higher percentage of sclerotia that are rotting. But as you can see in both of these examples, there are still going to be sclerotia that will be viable even under high soil moisture conditions. So we have to remember that even if these numbers are reduced by the flooding, there's still a possibility of the inoculum being there, and if we get wet conditions during flowering and during the sensitive period of the crop, we could still see disease showing up. So for variety selection, again, I've mentioned this already, but it's kind of just reiterating these different aspects of the integrated pest management, is that we do have some varieties that will improve, hopefully in the future, resistance to Sclerotinia. So we're seeing some canola varieties coming out with Sclerotinia resistance, and hopefully maybe even in other crops someday, who knows, but it could be a difficult task. But when it comes to any diseases, you can find out how much resistance you have by referring to your Varieties of Grain Crops manual. And rotating your varieties and their sources of disease resistance is another important aspect in addition to rotating your crops in general. So I've covered a lot of information, some quite specific to Sclerotinia and canola, some more general with Sclerotinia and other crops, and some just general information on crops and whether to spray or not. And I thought I would just finish off with a couple other things to watch out for because, of course, canola growers are other crop growers as well. And so I just wanted to mention some other things that we might be seeing this year. With canola, we always watch out for on our disease surveys for Sclerotinia, blackleg, aster yellows, and alternaria. So, you know, these are just diseases that we always want to watch out for. Blackleg, we've got good resistance in the varieties, but we want to make sure that that resistance is holding up. And so for watching for the disease, we can identify early on if we have any breakdown of resistance and if it's becoming a problem again. And with the cereals, we're seeing a lot of stripe rust across Saskatchewan and likely across the prairies this year, as we've had good conditions for disease given the cool, moist conditions that we've had, as well as stripe rust being a disease that is quite adaptable, quite variable, I mean, and it could be adapting to some warmer conditions that we have here in the prairies and starting to show up a bit more. So we're seeing a lot of that, as well as leaf spots, which are favored by moist conditions, so it's not surprising that we're seeing those. And a lot of spraying has been going on in cereals as well in some areas. Fusarium head blight was issue in some areas last year. We saw more of it in areas where we don't usually see it, given that last year we had wet conditions during cereal flowering. So again, we'll just watch as our cereal crops are getting into the flowering stage as well, whether or not conditions will be conducive for fusarium head blight. On the pulse crops, I've already discussed those a bit, but again, just anthracnose, ascochyta blight on lentils, ascochyta and mycostrella blight on peas, ascochyta blight on chickpeas, and these molds that include Sclerotinia and botrytis that we saw last year could show up later in the season if we get wet conditions. And on flax, one disease that seems to show up the most would be pasmo, but overall flax diseases aren't a huge issue or not one that we get a lot of reports on, but could be some potentials to watch out for, again, depending on the weather conditions. So if you're out in the field and trying to identify diseases, you can get information from books like Diseases of Field Crops in Canada, which has information on all crop diseases and photos. With the Ministry of Agriculture, we have fact sheets on various crops, diseases, lots of photos included. And we have the crop production newsletter during the field season. And if you're not already on this mailing list, you can get in touch with me. And basically every 2 weeks we send out updates that will include diseases, insects, various crop information. The Canola Council of Canada has a lot of great information as well in their fact sheets, grower manuals, and Canola Watch, again with some great photos that you can use to help identify any disease issues on canola. And guidelines on all aspects of canola agronomy as well. So with that, I hope that I've given you some useful information and open up for any discussion now, or you can jot down my email address or phone number and get in touch with me later on.
That's great, Faye. Thanks very much for that presentation. I'm just quickly going to pull up my slide here. Before we get into the question and answer, one thing I forgot to mention in the introduction is that we do have CCA credits available for the webinar today. So for anybody that wants to access those credits, this will be the access code, and you can again go to the webinar link, and there's a link there to submit your information that we need to submit for your credits. So I'll leave that up there while we get into the questions. And the first question we had from JC, it was more of a comment. It said it's plus 34 degrees today in Winnipeg. But just to build on that a bit, I guess, Faye, you talked about dry conditions reducing the risk from sclerotinia. Does temperature in and of itself have any impact on the risk, or is it strictly related to the moisture?
Well, like most diseases have that optimum temperature range where you'll get the most disease within a certain range, which is, I'm just trying to find in front of me if I can get that number for sclerotinia, but in general, even outside of the temperature, the most ideal temperature, anything below or anything above, you can still get disease development. And I think that moisture is probably the most important. But I would think with these, with the very hot, plus 30 plus conditions that we're having, that would be quite detrimental to the disease development. But we're also seeing that in some of these areas with the hot weather, we get thunder showers in the evening, which is going to be good for disease. So I think it's kind of a bit tricky because I think the moisture levels will be the most important. And I just apologize because I don't see the actual, I'm not seeing the number in my notes here in front of me, but I would think that in general the hot conditions will be less favorable for disease, but still possible if the moisture continues. But if it's dry, then that will really hold things back quite a bit.
Okay, great comments. Thanks, Faye. The next question was, you had commented in your presentation about some of the host crops, but Ernie had a question specifically about yellow, brown, and oriental mustard and whether they were susceptible to sclerotinia.
Well, the mustards will be susceptible to sclerotinia as well. I'm just not sure how much we hear about sclerotinia in those because maybe they're grown in areas that are usually a little bit more dry, but certainly they are susceptible. We just don't do surveys on those particular crops to know what kind of numbers we have, and I personally haven't had many calls on those over the last few years, but it is possible for them to be infected and could be another situation where if you have low levels of infection that you could still be just extending the development of the inoculum, even if it's not causing as much of an impact on the crop yield and causing a lot of damage.
That's great. Thanks, Faye. I imagine that question stemming from some of the wetter conditions in some of the southern parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. So good to know that those are susceptible as well. The next question from Jonathan just says that you mentioned that the 20 to 50% bloom is obviously the optimal time to be applying the fungicide. But various growers have for various reasons missed that window this year on some of their fields. If they wanted to spray a Sclerotinia fungicide beyond that 50% bloom, would a lesser rate of the fungicide, in recognition of the fact that the odds of an economic benefit are reduced, would a lesser rate of fungicide be a way to manage that risk, and would that lesser rate be effective?
Well, I don't have any data on that, but my gut feeling would be that I'm always hesitant to recommend a reduced rate for any reason. When we have concerns about things like fungicide resistance with any crop, not just talking about Sclerotinia, but any crop that we're looking at, we always recommend the full recommended rate at the proper timing, and if you're cutting the rates, who knows, you could be selecting for some of the Sclerotinia that might have, some fungicide resistance and is able to overcome it just that little bit better because you're using a reduced rate. I hesitate to recommend those reduced rates, and I don't think that you'd be satisfied with the disease control, and I don't think that past the 50% bloom stage that we're expecting as much damage due to the disease. So likely, although it might make you feel better that you're getting some control of those later infections, chances are it just won't be causing that much damage. I know I think it was 2 years ago, there was a wetter conditions came up later in the season, and we saw a lot of Sclerotinia, which was quite visible in the field. It was very obvious, but it didn't seem to cause that much yield damage because it was just on the upper branches, and a lot of farmers were quite frustrated, and you definitely feel for them because you want to be able to have done something to stop that, but at the same time, if it's not causing that much yield damage, even if it is quite visible and can be quite concerning to see, I just don't know that when it comes down to the wallet whether it's worth it to spray at all, and I'd rather see them save that application for another crop that's coming up on the right stage to spray, whether it be canola or another crop that might have a risk of another disease, rather than using a reduced rate on a situation where you are not expecting as much damage. That would be my kind of gut feeling, but like I say, that's not based on any data that I've seen, but stick to the registration for sure.
Great comments, Faye. And that's a good segue into our next question. It's actually about managing the Sclerotinia and some of the other crops in the rotation. So Bernard was asking if is there some benefit in spraying lentils for Sclerotinia before the canopy closes?
It's tricky because if the canopy closes and we get wet conditions and it's a very thick kind of crop to begin with, and the canopy closes and conditions become suitable for disease quite quickly, then I think there would be some benefit to that spray right before canopy closure. Plus you get the benefit of controlling Ascochyta and anthracnose if those are concerned. kind of gives you extra bang for your buck if you're treating different diseases if they are showing up with early signs and there is that potential concern for any of the above diseases. But I mean, that is a tough one because really I don't think that Sclerotinia botrytis will show up until quite a bit later after the canopy has closed. And so I wouldn't necessarily spray just for Sclerotinia botrytis as the canopy closes if there are no other disease issues showing up before that. But you also have to consider what is the rotation in that field, what was the seed quality going into the crop, if you might have introduced any of those diseases into the field when you planted the crop, how much inoculum that you expect is there, because if you think that there's a high risk of that inoculum being in the soil and the canopy closes and it's quite moist, then you could get some early control of it as it's closed and gets to kind of into that stage where the disease is forming. But if you don't think that you've had much of those diseases showing up in that field in the past and it doesn't, look like there's going to be a lot of moist conditions for disease development, then it might not necessarily make that big of a difference if you don't have other reasons to spray. It's tough though because I know that the products would work if the disease was there, but it's just that the disease on lentils shows up so much later than when our fungicide application would be taking place.
Okay.
It's kind of a wishy-washy answer, I know. But
no, those are good comments. The next question is about, you mentioned some of the rainstorms that have been going through. So the question from Karen was, will heavy rains be enough to wash infected petals off the canopy foliage? And kind of a secondary question, how long does that petal need to be lodged in that leaf axil to start that infection point and get the infection going into the stem?
Oh, these are good questions. Again, I don't have information. I've never heard actually before of this rain washing off the petals and being enough to deter the disease. I would think that the fact that the moisture that we get with the rain would be much more important and causing or being conducive for disease than some of the petals washing off, I would think. I don't really know for sure because, like I said, I've never heard of that before. But in terms of how long it takes for the infected petals to cause infection on the rest of the plant, I'm not sure, and I apologize for that. I'm trying to see if I can find any information just at my fingertips here, but I will keep looking as we continue talking, but I don't know the answer to that for sure.
Sure. So
Sorry.
While you're browsing for that, the next question was about the resistant varieties, and it's just a question: are resistant varieties adequate for Sclerotinia control? And I guess kind of the underlying question is that sufficient in and of itself?
Mm-hmm. I believe that the companies that have, or company that has Sclerotinia resistant varieties still recommend the spray application, so it's kind of like almost a synergistic effect, I guess, using the combination of the spray along with the resistant variety to get the most benefit out of both tools in your toolbox, I guess. If all other conditions are not conducive for disease and you're growing a resistant variety, then certainly, like with any other variety, you would lean maybe away from spraying if it's not a high risk for infection or doesn't look like economically worth spraying. But I don't believe that on its own, like with just the tolerance rather than true resistance, that at this time I don't think that the recommendation is to just go with the resistant variety, but that kind of the two-pronged approach of the resistant variety and the fungicide application.
Great. The next question was just related to the previous question about reduced rates, And so if a reduced rate overall is probably not a good strategy, do you have any experience or have you seen any information about the variable rate approach? So looking at variable rate application, we've heard of variable rate with fertilizer, but variable rate from a fungicide standpoint.
I don't. I've heard of it. I don't know that in this case, I guess, how you would use a variable rate fungicide for canola control of sclerotinia, because I think maybe with some other examples where I've heard of variable rate fungicides would be a situation where you have early signs of disease maybe, and using a higher rate in areas where you have early signs of disease, or maybe higher rates in areas of the field where you have a thicker canopy or things like that, and other crops where you might have multiple disease cycles and things like that. So I'm not sure what with canola and sclerotinia control, maybe because if the whole crop is past the point of flowering, generally you wouldn't be, I'm not sure what the variable conditions would be that you'd be assessing in the field for using a variable application. But again, I think it's just that risk of, if you're not using the full rate and getting full coverage of everywhere that the disease is showing up or that the pathogen is present, whether you might be selecting for fungicide resistance or not could be a concern. And just maybe not getting that full level of control. But it depends, I guess, on the variable rate situation. I'd be curious what variable conditions in the crop you'd be assessing in order to determine what variable rate of fungicide to use. But I think it could get to be a little bit tricky, kind of the same as, just applying kind of out of routine rather than in a situation where you have an increased disease risk. That we want to make sure that we have the best tools possible maintained for as long as possible, like good, fungicides that are highly effective and only used when they really need to be used.
Mm-hmm. The next question was with regard to, in the list of fungicides, you mentioned the contents for controlling the sclerotia in the soil. Mm-hmm. The question was, how successful is contents applied to areas of the field that usually get infected, such as lower areas or by shelter belts, areas where you tend to have that more conducive canopy, wetter areas in the field? Mm-hmm. Is that localized application sufficient, I guess, is the question.
Well, I think it depends on how confident you are that area is the only area where you've had the sclerotia developing, I guess, because even if you had areas of your field with higher levels of infestation, you could still have lower levels of the inoculum being produced in other parts of the field. But I think that just early indications of this product is that it can be quite successful in controlling the sclerotia that it comes in contact with. But there's just always that concern, like I was talking before, about most of the inoculum produced will end up within 100 meters of where the spores were produced, but there is a potential for them to spread a little bit farther if they get caught up in the wind or something. So I think within a field, if you have areas that may have a lower level of sclerotia being formed, they could still be producing spores. And while I think it would be a good thing to control the areas that had higher levels of sclerotia, you still run the risk of maybe having areas of the field that had low levels of sclerotia formed. It could still cause disease, and those spores could spread throughout the field. Even with better control of the sclerotia in the heavier infested areas. So depends on your confidence level in the amount of sclerotia produced across the field, and I think that could be hard to assess, but I think we'll just have to stay tuned on this product and see what kinds of information and research comes out of it, because it's just quite new and we're just learning a bit more about it at this point. So it'd be interesting.
Great. Thanks Thanks for that, Faye. I think maybe in the interest of time, there's a couple of other questions in here, but they're fairly product specific. And so what we'll do with those, the webinar program captures all of the questions that are submitted, and so maybe what we'll do with those is forward those directly to Faye, and she can respond to the people that sent in those questions specifically, because they look like they're fairly product specific, and I think Faye might need to do a little research before she gets back to you on them. So I think we'll wrap up the question and answer period. Again, want to thank Faye for her presentation today. A very timely topic, and certainly we've been getting lots of questions about with the later maturity on some of these fields, ongoing questions about the sclerotinia risk and how to manage it. So thanks very much, Faye, and with that, we'll wrap things up. Again, just a reminder about the CCA credits. You can submit for those through our website at the address on the screen, and just type in that code, and then we can submit for you on your behalf. So with that, I think we'll wrap things up. Thanks again for attending, everyone.